Welcome, Andrew. It's very nice to have you on our show. With the rise of DeepSeek, some viewpoints hold that open source become the mainstream of AI innovation. What's your point of view?
Well, DeepSeek was not the first to be open source in AI. I think it has demonstrated to be the most popular so far. And I do think that open source will continue to lead in innovation in AI as it has in other technologies. Today, if you look at the evolution of technology from cloud computing to the internet and so on, it's been based on open source technologies for the last couple of decades, and I think AI is going to follow that path.
So in your eyes, is the rapid flourish of DeepSeek an accidental event or a muscle?
Well, it's only, Liang, the founder of DeepSeek, given his history, he has been a believer in open source for some time. So I think we can view it as, given his experience, his expertise, that it was inevitable that he was going to open source it.
So traditionally, we think open source means technology outflow. It is quite harder for enterprises to build up a profit model with open source. But now we see the tech giants are shifting from closed source to open source, such as Baidu, Tencent, and the overseas giants like OpenAI and Google. So is the old logic broken?
I think so, but I think open source has proven that you can, just because something is open source doesn't mean you're giving it away for free. You can derive a lot of revenue from open source, and that's proven by companies like Elastic and DataStax and many others. I think the challenge here is what are the key, as AI becomes more and more open source, what are the key levers, like Baidu and the others, can use to generate revenue? What can the smaller startups? You have to know where your value lies in the AI stack really clearly. You have to focus, and then you have to build a flexible model. Could be a subscription model, could be an API license model. But I think it's important to recognize that the business model you have today may not be the business model that you want in 6 months or in 12 months. It has to be flexible.
With upstream and downstream partners, enterprises, and individual users converging towards the core AI models, is it that true that the industries pay more attention to the software application layer than the hardware infrastructure layer?
I think that's very true. It doesn't matter how good the hardware and the infrastructure layer is if you don't have applications, right? Because applications are what allow you to derive value from all this innovation in AI. Right? A hardware layer doesn't do anything for you except enable applications. Right, so yes. One thing that I want to mention that I don't think a lot of people realize is typically when there's a technological evolution, the end users, the big end users, the consumers, the banks, the retail companies, there's a gap between the time of the innovation and before they begin to deploy that at scale in production. Typically it's 2 to 4 years. Right? So the enterprises are waiting for it to mature a bit. That is not the case with AI. So we are seeing adoption by large corporations much faster with AI than we have with other technological evolution. And that's going to cause some challenges. Due to a skills gap, that's going to cause a challenge in competition for startups because large corporations, large enterprises, large banks are open sourcing their own software. And so if you're a startup and you want to build an AI platform or a solution that's targeted at financial services, say customer service or investment advisory services or whatever, and all of a sudden 5 of your largest target customers are open sourcing their own AI platform, that could be a real challenge for you as a startup. So my advice to startups is you have to pay attention to what your customers are doing because they're going to open source software also.
So I think open source means sharing the data, sharing your expertise. So How to handle its conflicts when we share the data?
So open source is obviously is based on collaboration, right? But it's also can be very highly competitive, and there's nothing wrong with that.
So how to achieve a healthy competition?
In my experience, it's really about how the creator of the software treats their community, their developers. And those communities that allow their developers to really participate in the governance of the software in some way are much more successful. The challenge is there's so much demand for developers today that if you don't treat them well, they're moving on to the next project tomorrow, and the next project, and the next project, right? So it's about how you treat your developers, and it's about how you make them feel ownership in your project.
So that's the role of developer community.
It's about allowing or helping your developers participate in the governance of the community, of the software itself, making sure that they can actually have a voice and they can help determine how that software evolves. So that goes to the governance model. That's very important. It's no matter how large your community is, they are still individuals. You may look at them as 100,000 developers, but they look at themselves as one individual. So you have to treat them as individuals, and you have to be able to connect with them at an individual level.
And how do you see the globalization trend of the open source developer community? So what's the role of it?
Oh, it's going to play a critical role in determining which companies and which technologies survive and thrive. But there is really no such thing as the global developer community today. There's a Chinese developer community, there's a European developer community, there's an Indian developer community, and they have different ways of operating. They have different cultural aspects, and so you can't treat them all the same.
So how to achieve an all-nation benefited open source AI platform for you?
So if a platform is truly open source, any nation can benefit. Right, that's the nature of open source. There is the Open Source Initiative, which is the governing body for open source licenses, and they have a 10-point checklist that helps determine whether or not your license is truly open source or not. So, for example, Facebook's Meta is partially open source. DeepSeek is not fully open source. Right, they have one license on the MIT, which is very open source, but the DeepSeek license isn't fully open source because it restricts certain types of usage.
What changes is open source models led by DeepSeek bring to the investment logic of AI industrial?
I've worked with a lot of startups and a lot of venture capital firms before, and one of the challenges is in order to gain, you have to give up. Right? You have to be willing to give up a bit of control to get the benefits of open source, and that's scary. Whether you're a startup or a large corporation or an investor who's just written a big check. You know, I just wrote this $50 million check and I have to give up some control. I don't want to do that. And I've worked with some venture capitalists that are extremely knowledgeable about open source. And they have a whole model, they have a whole set of metrics that they use to look when they look at a company and say, okay, this company has an open source offering, software, but does it meet certain criteria? Will it be able to gain a developer community? Will it be able to fast enough? Will it be able to gain a partner ecosystem, which is a critical element of success, right? An open source partner ecosystem. So they have a very detailed model in which they analyze these companies by. There are investment firms that will only invest in proprietary software, and there are some that are looking for open source.
Thank you for your time. It's a wonderful interview. Thank you.